Okay, so this webinar is part of our series about banning gas in towns in Massachusetts, particularly new gas hookups at the city and town level for buildings. And just a couple of housekeeping pieces, if you could go to the next slide, Rebecca. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about MCAN, but first let me just a couple of housekeeping things. The first thing is if folks are,
hey, Ann?
if folks have not muted
Andy,
themselves.
Could you help me for a moment?
If folks have not muted themselves, please do so. I just muted a bunch of you. If folks have questions, we're going to do a moderated Q&A at the end. And so what I'd like you to do is put your questions in the chat during the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and do the moderated Q&A. We've actually reserved a whole half hour for this because we think this is something that you guys are going to have a lot of questions about. And then but please don't try to answer each other's questions because it can be really distracting from the speaker. So, so go ahead and just put your questions in the chat, but don't try to answer anybody else's questions. And we will have a recording of this up on our website, like I said, and on our YouTube channel. So MCAN, as you guys may know, this is an MCAN and Mass Power Forward webinar. MCAN was founded in 2000, and we are a network of cities and town chapters around the state of Massachusetts. We have, I think, 53 or 54 chapters at this point that represent more than 100 towns. And basically what we do is that we help our local chapters make community level change and turn that into state and national level change to solve climate change. So we're really focused on the solution side of things. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to let you guys know about a couple of events that we have upcoming. These are all on our website, which you can see the link for at the bottom, which is a very nice, easy link. So anybody who lives in a municipal light plant should join us for our Muni Summit, which is happening in Belmont on January 25th. We have a webinar, which is part of a series about affordable housing as a climate solution. That's on the 28th. We are co-hosting with Mass Power Forward an anti-racism training that's going to be happening at Audubon's Drumlin Farm facility, and we really appreciate them lending us that space for that, as well as for our Muni Summit. And then, of course, we have our big annual conference coming up that we do with Toxics Action Center, which is the local environmental action conference, and that is on March 7th. So I hope everybody will join us for as many of those as are appropriate for you. Next slide, please. So just quickly, I think probably most folks on the phone know about Mass Power Forward, but it's a major coalition of grassroots groups across Massachusetts that are working towards a just and renewable Commonwealth that really is taking climate change on in a very visionary way. And so again, there is the anti-racism training on February 1st. There's also a lobby day, which is happening on the 14th at the State House, and you can find that on Facebook on the Mass Power Forward page on Facebook. So next slide, please. So just to set a little context, I like to do this at the beginning of all of our webinars and roundtables and events. You guys know that this is true, but climate change is already happening, and it is happening here in Massachusetts. It's already impacting our communities, whether it's tornadoes or flooding or droughts or extreme snowstorms. So it's here, and it's already impacting people's lives. Next slide, please. So the good news is that we know what the solutions look like, and local action has always been where climate solutions have started. So we've got a picture of town meeting in there. Town meeting is incredibly important. City councils, as you will hear, are incredibly important. Getting involved at the local level is key, and really having these solutions float up from the local level is really important. Next slide. So I just want to re-emphasize that we have the tools to make the better world that we want to see. We have them already. We know how to do this. It's just a matter of folks like yourselves getting involved to make this happen. And of course, one of the ways to make this happen is getting rid of gas. Next slide, please. So why would we want to get rid of gas? The big reason is that it's a fossil fuel. It's very polluting, and we are heating our buildings with it. We are heating our hot water with it right now, and it's responsible for buildings are responsible for over half of our energy consumption and over half of our carbon pollution in Massachusetts. So we really need to change the way that we think about heating our buildings and heating our hot water and get off of fossil fuels for those uses. Next slide. So we have an ongoing campaign at MCAN to get net zero planning and net zero buildings done. So if you're more interested in finding out more about that, please be in touch. But this is really, the banning gas is part of that. And getting our buildings to fossil fuel free. And it turns out that it's also healthier and more comfortable to live in a net zero building. So next slide. And obviously getting off of gas matters for not only for climate, but also for our health. Indoor air quality is a real issue. And then as we saw from the Merrimack Valley disaster, equity is a major issue when it comes to a lot of gas siting, pipeline siting, safety issues, and all of that kind of thing. So equity is a really big component of why we should be tackling fossil fuels and getting rid of climate change. So with that, next slide, please. I will go ahead and hand it over to Quinton, who is a Cambridge City Councilor, longtime advocate and president of Green Cambridge, and a great climate fighter. And he'll tell you a little bit about his work on this in Cambridge.
Thanks,
Clinton,
Carol.
are you?
I'm here.
Are you there?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Is it you that has a little bit of background noise?
No, it wouldn't be me.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so if we could go to the next slide, please. And welcome, everyone. So this is a picture of 10 Essex Street in Cambridge in Central Square. And this is a very new building. It was just built in 2018 and 2019. And you can see a whole bunch of gas meters on that wall. I'm assuming they will cover it up someday, but right now you can see them. And this is what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to avoid having new buildings built that look like this. So next slide. So just a quick overview of the presentation. So we'll talk briefly about the strategy of banning gas in each town, the context in Cambridge, the Berkeley, California law that we're basing our law on, and then our process for banning gas in Cambridge, some of the objections that we're getting to this ban, and then I'll talk briefly about the exemptions and why I think they are sufficient. Next. Next slide. So, oh, we skipped one. So the strategy that we're proposing is similar to what we're doing with the plastic bag bans, which it should really be regulated at the state level. But since the state isn't acting by having lots of towns and cities banning gas, we prompt the state to take action because it creates a lot of disparate regulations that the state will want to avoid that, but it also expresses our political will that this needs to be banned. And so it's really important that all the towns and cities that can take this action do so. In Cambridge, we have I'm getting some background noise there. In Cambridge, we got a legal opinion, which I've linked in this presentation, that says we can't do this without a home rule petition. And I urge all the towns and cities to do it anyway, because nothing would be better than having a court case where we get to argue why this needs to happen, why we need to ban gas right now, and I believe that the Attorney General's office would actually be on our side. We do want to be reasonable, so if there's a situation where a building cannot be built without gas, it should be allowed, but the default is that we build without gas going forward. So again, I urge all the towns and cities to not wait and see how this all plays out, but to actually move forward with your own bans so that we create a lot of pressure in the state to ban gas and to do so at the state level. Next slide, please. So in Cambridge, large buildings need something called a special permit from the planning board, and the planning board could recommend exemptions based on their review of the proposed building under the ordinance. The building permits are granted by inspectional services, and again, they could grant exemptions based on planning board recommendations or based on their own findings. And then we have a community development department that issues a lot of regulations around green buildings and things like that. So they could have more specific regulations around what kinds of buildings can be built without gas at any given time. And then as the technology and the economics advance, they could update those regulations. So there's lots of opportunities in the building permitting process in Cambridge for exemptions to be granted as needed in specific cases. Next slide, please. I think we skipped the slide on net zero Cambridge. If you could go back to that real quick. Yeah. So this just gives a quick overview, but the main point here is that we have a plan that the City Council adopted in 2015 for achieving net zero emissions in all our buildings in Cambridge. And we have a schedule that lists when specific buildings need to be net zero. And as you can see, the last buildings that have to be net zero new construction are laboratory buildings in 2030. So based on the schedule, it doesn't make any sense, since we're already in 2020, to build any buildings going forward that rely on gas, because we already know that we would have to go back and rip out that infrastructure in order for those buildings to be net zero and down the road. So it's a really important motivation for us in Cambridge to ban gas in new construction now, rather than simply waiting for this schedule to play out and to have lots of buildings built in the meantime, that we would have to go back and retrofit later, which is very expensive. Next slide, please. So the ordinance that we're working on in Cambridge is based on the Berkeley, California model, as the case in Brookline, and I worked very closely with Brookline on adapting it. And basically, the main sentence that's outlined in red here simply says natural gas infrastructure shall be prohibited in newly constructed buildings, and that's the meat and potatoes of it. It's pretty straightforward. And then it has these two exemptions. So one where it's simply not possible to build the building without gas. So this might be, if there's going to be a restaurant in it and that restaurant cannot, for some reason, prepare the food without burning gas. Or there's another exemption which has to do with the public purpose. So with the public interest, so for example, if there's a hospital and they need to burn gas to sterilize medical equipment and there's no other way for them to do it, then there could be an exemption granted under the public interest because the hospital would serve the public interest. Next slide, please. So the process, like I said, I adapted the language from Berkeley, and I got some help from Councilor Siddiqui, who is now our mayor, who is also a lawyer, and so she helped me with some of the legal aspects of it. As I mentioned, we work closely. Sorry, we got.
Hey, so there's somebody who's not muted. I'm trying to go through the list and mute everybody, but if you're talking to somebody in the background, we can hear you. Oh, I've got you. Okay. All right. I think I've muted them. Thanks, Quentin.
Thank you, Carol. As I mentioned, I work closely with Jesse in Brookline. We did have several stakeholder meetings along the way, which I list out here to emphasize
your webinar.
The importance of doing that.
Decarbonizing and banning gas.
Hey, so whoever's talking about decarbonizing and banning gas, you have unmuted yourself or you are not muted in the first place. So please go ahead and mute yourself.
So in September of last year, we had a Health and Environment Committee hearing in the council on the general concept, so before I introduced the specific language. And that went really well, and I got a strong sense from my colleagues that they were in favor of moving forward with this policy. So in October, I introduced the language via policy order and also asked for a legal opinion from the city solicitor. And finally, in December, we had an ordinance committee hearing, at which point we received the legal opinion, which said that we should file a home rule petition. But the council in the ordinance committee decided against that, and we voted the ordinance with a favorable recommendation to the full council. So it's now before us. The goal is to pass it to a second reading this month, and then at some point this winter to pass it into law. Next slide, please. So we did receive and are still receiving several objections along the way. I will also point out that we are getting many, many supportive letters from residents and from climate activists, of course, but also from architects and other people involved in the business, real estate business. But we did get opposition from the gas workers union for fear of losing their jobs, and of course I'm very sympathetic to that, and I've had several meetings with them, and I outlined a couple of things here that can be worked on with the gas unions, including maintenance of the existing gas infrastructure, which will need to continue for decades to come. And that's particularly important in terms of safety because, as we know, with the Merrimack Valley and other incidents, it's a very dangerous infrastructure, and so it's very important that we have skilled union labor maintaining and upgrading that infrastructure under our streets in existing buildings. There's geothermal district energy, which Eversource Gas is now working with Mothers Out Front to begin to do some pilots of that technology and that approach, and that requires very similar skills that could result and should result in union jobs. And then there's biogas, which is methane that's captured from decomposition of organic matter, which will also play an important role in the future, and again would require very similar skills to make that infrastructure work. I'm meeting with the Mass Biotech Council tomorrow. They're obviously very concerned because Cambridge is a biotech hub and they think they can't do the science without the gas. But I think the current exemptions in the ordinance suffice. If a developer were to come forward and say we want to build a lab building and we just can't do our work without burning gas in certain specific areas, then we would simply allow that until the technology changes and they are able to do it without the gas. And similarly with specific businesses like restaurants, developers who are objecting that it's too expensive to build. In fact, building all-electric buildings is cheaper than building them with gas. And then there are some people who are using poor people as a foil and say that we would be sticking poor people with high energy bills, and that's absolutely false. We should not be building inefficient buildings that require a lot of energy to heat them. We should obviously be building highly energy efficient buildings that only require a little bit of energy, and then that can be done via electricity instead of gas. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have two exemptions, which are just straight out of the Berkeley Ordinance. And again, I think these suffice to provide exemptions in cases where the use cannot happen without burning gas for now, and then eventually, as the technology and economics catches up, it will be able to do that. And in the case of a public interest, if we as a society want to make that trade-off and say it's more important to have this hospital here right now that burns gas, then we can do so under the existing ordinance. So I don't think that we need to make any excuses. We should, have the default position be that gas is not allowed, and then if there's no other way, we can allow the building to burn gas for a very specific reason, but not in general rely on it. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions later on.
Great. So yeah, exactly. So we'll do questions at the end. We've already got some in chat, but keep them coming. And Werner, let's go ahead and move on to Werner's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. We're very excited about what we've done in Brookline and what's happening in Cambridge and a number of other communities. And as Quentin said, we really hope that many communities will follow us. And in fact, I'm going to reinforce quite a bit of what Quentin has said because, and I think that's important because even though Brookline and Cambridge have taken quite different approaches, we actually agree on most of the strategic considerations. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Let's start with the biggest question. Where does a community get the authority to prohibit fossil fuels in new construction and rehabilitation? State and local government in the United States have what's called police power. That is, they have the very broad power to protect the public welfare. And as I'm sure most of you know, Massachusetts is what's called a home rule state, which means that our Constitution gives all of our communities the power, with certain limitations, to enact any law that the state legislature could legally delegate to them. The limitation, that particularly one that's important here, is the preemption doctrine, which is very simply that state law preempts local law. So therefore, a community may not enact a law that's inconsistent with state law, or tries to control things where the state has already acted and has intended to, quote unquote, occupy the entire field. So in Brookline, the first thing we had to do was to decide exactly what sort of police power we wanted to exercise. And our first thought was zoning, since zoning is a police power that the legislature has already specifically given to the towns. So the question is, could gas infrastructure be considered a use that could be prohibited or made subject to a special permit under zoning? And in Brookline, for instance, and probably other communities too, there are some things that seem a bit like infrastructure that are listed as uses, like electricity transformers or telecommunication antennas or ground-mounted solar. But those sorts of things are usually the sort of infrastructure that serves a whole neighborhood. They're not just part of a single building. So as we worked this through, we thought that it was a stretch to say that fossil fuel infrastructure, which does serve to keep the building heated, is a use of that building. So we didn't think it really should be regulated under zoning, and we didn't take that route. Now, we've had a couple people say to us that we should have done this under zoning, although, in fact, the first person that said that was someone who opposed the bylaw, so I'm not sure what that's worth. But it's an open question. I mean, this is all very new, and I would encourage all of you who are listening to not just take our word on this or anything else, but instead talk with your own lawyer and think about it, and make sure you're comfortable with the idea that zoning isn't the way to go, or maybe it is the way to go for you. In any case, so where do we go next? We looked very briefly at public health regulations, but we decided not to pursue that. And then we knew that we couldn't enact a local building code. Again, as I'm sure most of you know, there's a state building code that's very comprehensive, and under this preemption doctrine, it's 100% clear that you can't enact anything that's in conflict with the state building code. But we looked through the code, and we didn't see anything in there that says anything about what kinds of fuel you can use in a building. So perhaps that means that we can use our broad police power to enact a general bylaw to protect the public from climate change. But the next step, in a sense, is, but look how comprehensive the building code is. So under this preemption doctrine, is the building code so comprehensive that the state must have intended to occupy the field? And in addition, there are also a whole different set of state regulations and laws having to do with public utilities. So the big question in front of all of us is, does our fossil fuel prohibition run afoul of state law in either of those ways? It's a big unanswered question. No court has ever addressed it. As we did our work, we started early in the summer for fall town meeting, where we talked to 14 different lawyers, and pretty much to a person they said, yeah, gee, that's a very interesting question. None of them said we were crazy, and the majority were quietly encouraging, which, in my view, if a lawyer is quietly encouraging, that's a good sign. They're often very willing to tell you not to try to do something. So we went ahead. Our bylaw is a general police power bylaw that's permitted by the Massachusetts Constitution, and there's a statute that sort of fleshes that out a little more, just to provide a little more clarity. That's Chapter 40, Section 21. We're optimistic. We honestly think that our bylaw isn't telling anyone how to build a building, but only what they can put in it. We don't think it's regulating the gas company. We think it's more like a general bylaw that's already on the books. In Brookline has been there for years, that regulates the storing of chemicals and gasoline. So we think we have the power to do this. Next slide, please. So what about overall legal strategy? What we're saying is the more the merrier, and the sooner the better. It was exactly what I think what Quentin said, and this is why. Under home rule law, a town, unlike a city, a town bylaw doesn't go into effect until the AG approves it. Personally, I think our bylaw will be approved, although it's certainly an unanswered question, so I wouldn't bet the ranch on it. The AG could rule tomorrow, or it could be 6 months from now. The AG's role is to be the umpire, and I trust them to call this as fairly as they can. But this will be a very close call. And one thing that I think is slightly helpful to us is that the legal requirement is that if the town gets to first base at the same time as the opponent's ball does, as it were, the law is that the call goes in favor of the town. So that helps us a little. But in addition, since it's going to be a close call, we think that if the AG sees a lot of towns and cities doing this, and because they believe that this is good policy, we think that will help just a little bit. And second, each community's version of this is bound to be different, and that's a very good thing. And I think what that means is that the AG will be able to think about what specific things might be in conflict with state law and which ones aren't. And we hope that they will be able to say that at least some of the laws enacted, or bylaws or ordinances, are valid, and then give us hints about what we can do to make the others valid. So for those reasons, we really hope people will move quickly, and we'll see more and more of these bylaws and ordinances. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Tactics is something that, well, we thought we could have gotten a bylaw that was tougher substantively through town meeting if we'd wanted to, but we decided to aim for unanimity instead. We got support from every major board in town, and the key to doing that was that we did as much outreach as early as possible as we could. And we really listened hard to the concerns that we heard. At the beginning, there were a lot of concerns. I mean, it's a very new idea that sort of sets people that haven't been following this back on their heels a little. But we responded with an open mind. We made practical accommodations, and we won just about everybody over to the idea. And as a result, we think we have a very practical bylaw. Two other tactical points that I think you should bear in mind if you go forward with this is that in everything you write or draft or say, or in your whole approach to this, focus on climate change, not safety or leaks. They came up occasionally, but we believe that to keep the bylaw legally sound, it's very important to stay focused on climate change, not those other things. Similarly, something that can be very supportive is if in the purpose of the bylaw and all the discussions, you make the connection that this is tied to the goals in the Green Communities Act, which is already state policy. Next slide, please. Perhaps the biggest practical piece of advice I'd have is keep it simple. And of course here, this is one of these do as I say, not do as I do things. In our view, every time you add something, either procedurally or substantively, particularly exemptions, you not only weaken the bylaw, but you also increase its chances of being overturned. As I say, we made a judgment that we wanted to get as much support as we could, and we added things, exemptions and other things when we thought it was reasonable, but we did it knowing full well that it would both weaken the bylaw and it could hurt us in front of the Attorney General. So this is part legal reasoning and it's part gut feeling. I mean, for instance, when you exempt cooking, as we ultimately did, we certainly didn't plan to, but then the whole thing looks a little more like building code because it's another detail that the building inspector has to keep in mind. Another whole complicated area is the idea of enforcement and appeal provisions. We chose not to put any provisions like that. we chose not to put any enforcement or appeal provisions at all in the version that we filed in the warrant originally.
I'm joined now by David Littleproud. He's the minister responsible.
As I say, with both our original and our final versions are enforced through denial of a building permit. There's some risk that makes it look too much like a building code provision as well, but we don't think it does, and we decided to take that risk. You all, when you do it, might come up with another mechanism. A less risky way might be impose a fine. The statutory provision I referred to earlier, Chapter 40, Section 21, permits fines of $300 per offense. Could you say that each day a building's out of compliance is a separate offense? I honestly don't know. Ask your lawyer, but there could be other approaches. Similarly, originally we had no appeal provision since we felt that there's enough case law that says that people always have a right to take an appeal to the courts. But this was something else that people in the different boards and people in the community asked us to do, and we accepted it in the interest of building consensus. That brings me back, I guess, to my earlier point, which in my view is really the toughest question here, which is that there's really no answer to a lot of the legal questions here. That putting together a bylaw like this, there are all kinds of judgments that have to be made where there are not clear answers. And we hope that communities won't worry too much about that. We hope that you'll do what we did, which is to sort of survey the water for any obvious obstacles and then just dive in. It seems to me the really big question is how bold do you want to be? Do you want to be as practical and as accommodating as we were, or do you want to push the envelope? And I hope that different communities will do both of those things. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Werner. So we put together a few brief next steps. Rebecca, if you want to, yeah. So I think the important pieces are, we are entering town meeting season, spring town meeting season, for those of you who have spring town meeting, and we're hoping that everybody will start connecting with other people in your community that are interested in gas bans. We can help you with that. And if you don't already know, you should find out your warrant article schedule. And we also have a listserv that we've started for folks that are interested in this topic, and it gives you access to some folders and stuff like that. So those are the things that I would say for next steps. And I have a whole bunch of questions that you guys have been kind enough to ask in the chat, and I'm going to start directing those. So I think the first one probably is for you, Werner, which was an early question. Isn't the Brookline ban a hookup ban, not a gas ban?
Well, it's a little complicated. It's neither of those. It's a ban on fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, the words are carefully crafted.
Yes.
And it's not just gas. I mean, it's all fossil fuels. That would include propane even.
Great. So, Quentin, I thought maybe there were some questions about labor concerns and addressing that, and I know you spoke briefly about that, but if you could just remind folks how you've been responding to the labor concerns and what you feel like some of the options for being at the table with folks are.
Yeah, so again, I think the most important thing is to engage in conversations with the unions, definitely hear them out, and definitely sympathize with them. They're under a lot of stress, and they are in danger of losing a lot of jobs. The reality is that, when I told them this, that we're going to transition from fossil fuels anyway, whether we do these bans or not. All these bans are doing is trying to make it happen faster. So they have to be prepared, and we have to help them to get into this new future and transition to renewable energy. And we have to make sure that part of that transition, that it's a just transition, and that part of that includes jobs and justice for labor. So, you know, it's not something that we can directly address in this ordinance or in this effort in terms of banning gas, but it's part of our broader movement that we have to continually look at, you know, how do we make sure that people have jobs, and particularly when it comes to the gas workers, you know, again, there's a lot of investments that need to be made in maintenance and safety of the existing gas infrastructure. And again, that's not directly part of this bill or this ordinance, but in general, it needs to happen. And so there are ways that we can advocate for that. And then there are opportunities in new technologies like geothermal and biogas that can provide jobs for the gas workers union specifically.
Great, thank you. So I think one question was, Werner, can you just outline, somebody said, doesn't the AG's office only have 90 days to get back to Brookline about your bylaw? Is there, can you just clarify in terms of the timeline there?
Yes, initially the Attorney General has 90 days, but they can request an extra 90-day extension, and we'd almost automatically give them that. In addition, the town clerk has some time to file, and we've been trying to get our town clerk to file it as quickly as possible, but we may not even have it filed with the AG until January 11th. Great.
Can one of you guys talk about, I don't know who this would be for, but I know that there was a question about the difference between natural gas and propane, and why, you know, whether propane is included in these, and if not explicitly, why not, and if so, why that would be.
Well, in Brookline, it covers all fossil fuels. And in all honesty, we didn't look real carefully if you're a rural community where there's outdoor propane. We didn't look at that in great detail, and that's the kind of thing somebody would have to look at on their own. Although, for instance, initially we made an exception for outdoor grills for propane there. That was the one that a very small exception we made in the very beginning.
And Quentin, does yours cover propane as well?
I don't believe so. I mean, you know, in Cambridge, we're really dealing primarily with very large buildings where that's just not an issue. I know in the biotech industry, I've worked in the industry for a while. There is some use of propane cylinders, and personally, I don't think it's worth, you know, worrying about that piece. It's really about natural gas, which is just piped in huge quantities, and we just don't want to be building a dependency on that primarily for heating the buildings.
And we actually have a couple questions about oil heating as well, which I'm not sure if there are new buildings being heated with oil. Or gut renovations which continue to be heated with oil, but maybe if you guys can just quickly address that.
Yeah, I mean, again, in Cambridge, that's not an issue. There's, of course, legacy buildings that might still be using oil, and those need to be transitioned, but in terms of new construction, it just doesn't really come up.
Yeah, I think our feeling was that we just wanted to cover all the bases and make sure we didn't find somebody that said, well, if you want me to put gas in, I'll just put an old-fashioned oil burner in.
Werner, can you just go a little bit deeper on, somebody said, why should we not talk about safety or gas leaks? Can you just go a little bit deeper on why you felt like, why you guys decided that staying away from that particular topic was smart? Those particular topics?
Basically, I mean, there may be a number of issues. I think the most important thing there is this idea of preemption, that if you start talking about safety, then there's a danger of the AG ruling or somebody suing you or something, the gas company or something, saying, well, there already is a state statute that deals with safety issues, and therefore this bylaw, you claim it's about climate change, but you also in your preamble said something about gas leaks, and that the state has already regulated that, and therefore your bylaw is illegal because your real intent here is to go after safety issues. So by sticking with climate change, we can say, well, there may be a statute about that protects people from leaks and from explosions and such, but we're not trying to touch that. We're focused solely on climate change. And I think it also makes for an easier message in terms of talking with people in town, getting votes in town meeting and such to you know, you can let other people may say that. We've heard people say, well, you know, this is the other thing about this, we ban this stuff, then we don't have to worry about explosions either. And we go, yeah, well, sure, that's great, but that's not what we're trying to do. We're focused on climate change.
I think the legal preemption point is a really important one, so I hope that everybody heard that one loud and clear, because I think that is a concern. So one question is, does this push folks explicitly toward heat pumps, and is that financially viable? I know that Brookline looked a lot at sort of the different technologies that are available and sort of the financial viability. Do you want to touch on that first, Werner, and then maybe Quentin, you can talk about it as well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, some people may be able to do ground source heat pumps, but that's very expensive in terms of upfront capital, even though very economical in the long run. But by and large, we expect that nearly everyone will do it with air source heat pumps, and that's what we did. As you said, we looked at a lot of different scenarios. I mean, one thing that's hard is every building is different. Brookline, you know, unlike Cambridge, still has quite a few. I mean, Cambridge may have a lot of renovations of residential, but probably has even less, you know, buildable land than we do. We still have a few. We still occasionally see brand new houses on empty lots and so on. So we have those. That's completely different from, you know, a commercial building and so on. So it's hard to, you know, it's very hard to generalize. But for instance, the clearest case is with single-family homes, where the Rocky Mountain Institute actually did a study, and I think, as I recall, they did it in all different climate things and so on, which basically showed that the upfront costs of doing air source heat pumps instead of traditional gas were about $800 different, and that's even before rebates. So if you're building a house in Massachusetts, the kind of money you're spending to build a house, $800 is just completely lost in whatever. And it's very easy to talk to people about that, because one of the reasons for that is that particularly even right now, but particularly going forward, very rarely does anybody build a house without air conditioning. So when people take the additional approach, they put in two systems. They put in an air conditioning system, and they put in a heating system, a gas heating system. And since heat pumps do both, that's an easy way to explain to people, you know,
right,
on an intuitive level, why it's not hugely more expensive to go with air source heat pumps.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Quentin.
Just to build on that really quickly, the other thing that's happening with climate change in Massachusetts is that we're going to see a shift from mostly heating days to mostly cooling days. And so, as Werner points out, a lot of people are putting in central air conditioning anyway. And so, you know, again, this being focused primarily on new construction, it makes all the sense in the world to use air source heat pumps.
And we did have a question, which gives me an opportunity to make a plug for our stretch code work, which was, are there any towns that are going to require passive house as a stretch code? And the answer to that is towns can't pass their own stretch code. There is a statewide stretch code, and that statewide stretch code desperately needs updating. If folks are interested in being a part of that, in addition to considering doing a gas ban in their community, it's actually, we have a lot of advocacy opportunities around that, and it's really important to hear from cities and states across, cities and towns across the state that a better stretch code, that a net zero stretch code, a fossil fuel free stretch code is really important to folks everywhere. So, so I think I just want to make a plug for, if you're interested in that issue, please go onto our website and click the link to volunteer, and we'll go ahead and get you involved in that. So I think one last question that I'd like to actually wrap up with is, somebody asked, how does this set us up for better state and national policy? So how do these bans sort of provide a springboard? Because obviously just Cambridge making this change, just Brookline making this change is not going to solve climate change. But if we can make this a springboard to better state and national policy, then we can start seeing the kind of change that we want. So I know that both of you guys, we talked about this yesterday, and both of you guys have great answers on this. So does somebody, Quentin, do you want to get started with that?
Sure, and I go back to, this is really primarily an expression of our political will. And the more we do that, and the more we make it clear that we want strong action on climate change by passing these laws and passing these warrant articles, the easier it becomes for our state and federal legislators to take action as well. And we're already seeing that, here in the state with several legislators who, even just 2 or 3 years ago, weren't really that excited about climate change and taking action, and now are seeking us out and putting forward bills and really starting to take action because they recognize that there's a lot of political will to take climate action.
Yeah, what I would like to add to that is that is related to the stretch code in a sense, which is I 100% agree that people working on the stretch code at a state level is a really important thing. And particularly, Carol, I was happy to hear you say a fossil fuel-free stretch code, because that's where we should ultimately be heading. Because it seems to me one of the real important things about all of us talking about this, doing these things in our community and educating our own communities and people around the country, is to make the shift that I think even those of us that have been working on climate change for a long time, a few years ago, we were all really very, very focused on energy efficiency, which is a good thing. But at least speaking for myself, I know that several years ago, the bell hadn't exactly gone off that, no, 90% efficiency or 90% reduction, say, in emissions isn't enough. We need to go to zero. And that's almost a paradigm shift. And I think one of the real values, and so for instance, again, energy efficiency is great, but we chose to do this warrant article because on a certain level, we don't care in a new building about how energy efficient it is if it's fossil fuel free. First of all, the architects are going to have to make it very energy efficient to make it fossil fuel free, because otherwise their client will be spending too much on electricity. But more important, but even if it's not passive housing, even if it's just meeting the current stretch code, right now again we ran the numbers, and that even though the grid right now is still a little brown, and more than a little brown, even right now a house that's built with air source heat pumps has fewer total emissions than one with gas, including the emissions that are attributable to where the electricity is generated. So even right now, if it's important to be getting people to think, yeah, energy efficiency is good, but energy efficiency is in service of the idea that we have to stop all emissions from new buildings.
Yeah, great point. So thank you so much, Werner and Quentin. Thank you to Rebecca for running all the technology for this, and even though the slides were sticky, for keeping things going. I put us back on the event slide just so that folks can keep an eye on what we've got coming up. So thank you, everybody, for giving us an hour of your evening, and we look forward to connecting with you online and having you be a part of a listserv and to continued conversations. So have a great rest of your evening, everybody. Thanks again, Werner and Quentin.
Thank you very much, Carol. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Werner. Thank you, Quentin.
Good night, everyone.
Carol.
Bye.
Good night.